In this episode, I sit with anthropologist Dr. Doreen Gordon to talk about her experiences at the 30th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, commonly known as COP30. Held in Brazil in November 2025, COP30 formed part of the annual United Nations Climate Change Conferences, the world's primary multilateral decision-making forum on climate change, bringing together almost every country on Earth. In this reasoning, Doreen reflects on what the gathering revealed about power, participation, and the future of climate justice. Our conversation moves through the tensions between visibility and decision-making power, the financial and linguistic barriers that shape who can enter global climate spaces. We consider what becomes possible when Indigenous and Maroon communities participate as knowledge holders, research partners, decision makers, and stewards of climate finance. We also return climate change to the intimate and the ancestral. Beyond economic loss, climate devastation can sever relationships with land, memory, burial grounds, culture, and belonging. This is a reasoning about inheritance, power, climate governance, and the knowledge we must carry forth together.
Can you share maybe a memory, an image from a COP30 that stayed with you?
Well, the first thing that struck me, of course, was that the COP30 was called a Mutirão, which is a Brazilian indigenous term that means communities coming together to work together towards a solution. And the Brazilian government used this indigenous term and incorporated it into the COP30 event because they really wanted this COP to be one that was action-oriented, one where the different countries would put aside their differences and their quarrels and come together and work on action for the future. So that really struck me when I arrived at COP30. The first day I arrived, it was to the green space. COP30 was divided into the green space and the blue space, and the green space was open to the public. And on the wall outside, there was like, Global Mutirão 30. So right there was an indigenous term being used. And indeed, it was dubbed the Indigenous COP because there was a massive participation of Indigenous people more than ever before because they came from all over South America, from all the way in the Andes, right across the Amazon. And many of them arrived in a flotilla, a boat that arrived in the port city of Belém. And I think it was about 4,000 of them. So the city there were a lot of indigenous people in the city, and particularly in the green area of COP. Only a small number, like I think 1,000, were allowed in the blue section of COP. So on the one hand, the indigenous people were being incorporated more than ever before, and their terms were being used and so on. And there was also a massive indigenous mobilization to go to COP, where indigenous people were basically saying that they are the answer, right? A resposta somos nós is the phrase that they use. It means the answer is us. And they believe that their indigenous knowledge is important for COP30, and they actually want to be stewards of the land, of parts of the forest, to preserve it for future generations. So, there was a big indigenous mobilization. They were incorporated into COP to some degree, but on the other hand, they were very loudly critiquing that they were, and rightly so, that they were not at the tables where the decisions were being made. They were not at the same negotiating table as the powerful countries. And so they had a kind of symbolic power and presence, but not really decision-making power. And so, it struck me that COP30 was making an effort, and Brazil was making an effort to really incorporate indigenous people. They were allowed to protest. They were allowed to carry on their indigenous campaign. The media interviewed them. They were allowed some access to different areas of COP30, but on the other hand, did not seem able to be at the negotiating table. What I didn't see so much of were Afro-Brazilians who also live in the Amazon and other parts of Brazil and are also being affected by climate change. There were a few representatives, but not a lot. That was a visible kind of absence, but Indigenous people were very visible in the city. And I thought that was different touch to Club 30. And I was really happy to experience Brazil. It was amazing for me that Brazil was putting on this very well organized and well thought out. They had prepared for this COP30, despite the news that was coming out in the media that there were protests and the Indigenous people apparently stormed the building at one point. There was a fire in the building. There were all kinds of drama that happened at COP30. But this is not unusual for COP. Like around the world, there usually are protests and so forth. So I wouldn't come out and say Brazil was bad at organizing that. I think they definitely put an effort into bringing Indigenous people into the conversation.
I feel like you're opening us up with so many layers and so many textures there. The fact that inclusion is hard, that inclusion is complicated and messy. That phrase that you use, the answer is us. How powerful. When we think about the work that activists are doing in the global south, I think that kind of sums it up. The answer is us. So I can't wait to unpack all the nuances that you just surfaced already. It's already rich. But coming from that, who are you and how did you come to this work? You mentioned that Brazil is your area of specialization. I'm familiar with a text that you have written about Brazil as well.
Grew up in the 70s. I'm a 70s child. And my family was politically involved to different degrees. I know my mother's family was a big supporter of Norman Manley, the very nationalist vision of building the nation. And then my father was involved politically as well in leftist politics in Jamaica. So the kinds of discussions and the networks that I had were always about social justice issues. It was critically looking at your society, at power, at inequality. I was always aware of these things because my father used to take me on a Sunday. The family went on a Sunday drive every week. We went out as a family and drove to different parts of Jamaica so that we would be aware of how Jamaicans lived in different places, rural areas, inner city Kingston. He knew Kingston very well as a sociologist. And I guess, through experience of carrying out surveys and so on, he knew all the back roads. And he would take us around and we were very aware from very small, from children, right? The realities of different people in Jamaica. And then my parents also made very conscious choices about education. For example, they wanted us to go to school in schools that ordinary Jamaicans went to. So we went to a government primary school. And after that, we chose a school in halfway tree for high school education. Think what my father wanted is for me to have an appreciation of the Jamaican society, to understand, different social relations, different classes, and to be able to move in that space, right? I always had a kind of social conscience. It's not surprising that I ended up as an anthropologist, sociologist, exploring communities. So that's my kind of background. And of course, I would have followed my dad's social circles, the intellectual circles, discussing race, class, and all these other issues. But at some point, I wanted to experience somewhere outside of Jamaica and learn another language. And when I chose anthropology as my discipline, my father died when I was just 17. And my sister was 15. And perhaps his death was something that shaped my entrance into sociology. But I actually didn't start off in the social sciences. I started in the natural sciences. And then I decided that wasn't really for me because I loved the sea. My family used to take vacations every summer, coast, in Hanover, where my mother's family is from. So I just loved the sea. So I was kind of keen on being a marine biologist. So I started off in the natural sciences and then I was like, I don't think this is for me. And I came to my own process that I should transfer to the Faculty of Social Sciences, and I focused on sociology and anthropology. You know, those days we had Barry Chevans, we had Don Robotham, and these really good teachers and mentors. But by the time I got to graduate education, I wanted to get out of Jamaica. As many island people do, want to experience something different. And I chose Brazil. So that is how I came upon going to Brazil, because I think it was somebody who suggested that the northeast of Brazil is very similar to the Caribbean, and I would like it. The music is nice, the culture is nice, and you won't feel like too far from home. Obviously, you have to learn the language. And I found a Brazilian teacher in Jamaica, and I started taking Portuguese classes like 1 year before starting graduate education. And then when I started my PhD in the UK, I took more Portuguese lessons. And then I went to Brazil to do my fieldwork, and I was there for 16 months or something like that, doing my fieldwork on Blackness and Black middle classes in Salvador, Brazil, which is a beautiful city and will remind you very much of Jamaica. And so I felt at home. It's just that I had to learn the language, you know, and I got going with it maybe after about 8 months. And, you know, because learning Portuguese is not easy, but it is a beautiful language. So that's how I came to Brazil. And after my PhD, I settled back into Jamaica, eventually into a more permanent position in the Department of Sociology. And I continued to visit Brazil. I went in 2013 in the summer, went in 2017 in the summer as well, and then again for COP 2025. So I was really looking forward to that trip at COP 30. I was like, oh, wow, it's going to be in Brazil and I can get to go back there, right? And going to Brazil is very expensive. It's not something you can do every year. So I really looked forward to coming back to Brazil. And this time around, when I came back, new Brazilians. In fact, I wasn't going to go to COP 30 again because the whole trip looked very expensive. You have to stay there for 2 weeks in Belém in the negotiations. So you have to find accommodation, airfare to go to Belém, and the prices were astronomical for accommodation. Many countries were complaining about that. And I said to my Brazilian friends, I don't think I can go. You know, I really wanted to go, but I don't think I can afford it. And they said to me, oh, no. We have family or friends or so living in Belém. You can go and stay with them. And I said, oh, really? So I didn't know these people, but they opened up their house to me, a friend of a friend. That was a very Brazilian experience because I was right in his household, his family, in an ordinary Brazilian neighborhood, having to negotiate transport, the traffic, cooking in the evenings. It was nice to have that experience because it contrasted with the very glitzy kind of venue at COP 30, and it contrasted with all the diplomats and the government delegations. And then there I was in this Brazilian neighborhood, eating with them in the evenings and so on. And so I really enjoyed that entrance back into Brazil.
You come from an intellectual and a cultural tradition that really set you up to be at COP, to be involved in climate. Although you said, you went from marine biology to social sciences. You were supposed to be involved in climate work and ecology and understanding the systems and how they work. And I'm always amazed by how things just seem to happen. But when you look at it, the flow is there.
It flows and it comes full circle, doesn't it?
Full circle. I think that really stands out to me. And then when you speak about Brazil, it does sound like a Caribbean space.
But just bigger, like the hugeness of the country will strike you when you get there. Yeah. And also the diversity. They have a large number of indigenous people. They also have quite a significant population of Japanese who migrated to Sao Paulo. So, and then of course you have your Afro-Brazilians and Euro-descended Brazilians. So it's cultural and a racial mix.
Yeah, you started off by speaking about the indigenous communities in this large venue. You are a Caribbean woman in this large venue as well. You reflect on a moment before, even during COP, that kind of clarified for you what the stakes of being a Caribbean woman in a global climate arena really means.
Well, I think it's important to really talk about that financial issue.
Yeah.
For women academics or women, there are a lot of environmental organizations led by women and young women as well out there, and not able to participate in the process at all because of the cost. And it's something that is increasingly being brought up as something that hampers their presence at COP30, hampers the presence of grassroots organizations, NGOs, researchers. So I think that experience of having to figure out how to get there. I looked at all kinds of different routes to get to Belém that, were affordable. How was I going to stay there for that length of time? Where was I going to stay? These occupied my thoughts for a good while. And I thought this must be like a common thing. I couldn't just be me. I felt when I was going to Brazil, really privileged to be able to work out a way to get there. So I have to really kind of point that one out, that being there in that space brought to my attention the financial constraints for women, for young people, for environmental organizations, grassroots organizations in the region, youth leaders in the Caribbean to participate in that process. We really have to look at that. Like, how can we fund? I mean, how the indigenous people did it was by basically coming together, mobilizing communities, raising funds. They were like preparing for months before, but raising funds so that they could travel. And I remember seeing entire families, not just one or two representatives, like from a family or just the indigenous leaders, like the community comes. You see grandparents, parents, children, the whole family, and I like, how did they manage to make that journey? Then you know that they have been preparing for some time. They were funding, they were campaigning, they were mobilizing so that they could help each other to go. And I think we have to look at that in the Caribbean because, you have to be at the table. If you're not at the table, then your voice is not being heard, and there's several rooms, there's several events taking place at COP30. And it's good to have a representative in each room to kind of just bring the issue of small island developing countries to the fore, because it will get swallowed up by everybody else's interests. Though what was striking for me at COP30 was Minister Matthew Samuda's talk in the plenary, the opening session, when each country gives talks about what they have been able to achieve and make some demands as well. He recorded a video because he was in Jamaica dealing with the after effects of Hurricane Melissa.
Yeah.
The video was excellent. It was really well done. And he really was able to bring across the life and death ramifications of climate change for small islands. It's an existential dilemma. And that was brought across to the audience very clearly. So we got that point across at COP30. And there were other small islands that were also supporting us, not just in the Caribbean, but Pacific islands, the islands off the coast of Africa. The message that came across there and the fact that COP30 happened right after Hurricane Melissa really put on the platform the importance of climate finance and loss and damage finance. And we were able to see some achievements there because the climate finance countries all committed to triple climate finance for countries that are affected. Even though we're small with Talawa, and we were able to get that message across, So that is the importance of having a presence at COP30 and making your voice heard. And this COP30 as well highlighted women, gender in climate change quite a bit. And so it would have been nice to see more women leaders, youth leaders, and so on from the Caribbean participate. And there were sessions, for example, workshops on helping climate activists, young climate activists work with communities. What are the different strategies they can use? And I could have seen our NGO leaders and young people really benefiting from that.
You're taking us inside of COP30, and presence, absence, knowledge of the politics is an important element. It is very much alive. I want to talk about young people for a little bit. You kind of hinted at it just now. You said there was a focus on gender, but you spoke about sessions that focused on youth activism. So how did meaningful, and I'm using the word meaningful very intentionally, meaningful youth participation, what did that look like in this COP? And did you see it? Where did you see it?
Well, there was a blue zone and a green zone. So the green zone of COP30 was kind of more open to the public. It was more open to NGOs, civil society organizations. And then you had the blue zone that was more the diplomatic corps, the government delegations, that, it was definitely a venue that was hard to get into. And
something blue and green.
Yes, I mean, my first time there, I thought that I could go from the green space to the blue space. But as I moved in that direction, the security was like, no, you have to take a bus to get all the way to the blue space. So, it is some way away, and you have to go through the designated security checks and so forth. So it's not easy to get into the blue zone, and there is security, and you get your ID and everything, and you get inside, and that's when you realize that over here doesn't look like the green space for sure. Like there are not as many indigenous people, not as many young people, not as many Afro-Brazilians. So you can already see in the space itself that it's mainly government delegations, but also some participation was allowed to indigenous people. I remember attending an indigenous forum, and they were all in indigenous dress, and they were allowed to enter the blue space in indigenous dress. And I saw young people were in the blue space too. They had youth-led forums that were led by them entirely. But I found that while they were there, and there was a lot of talk about incorporating young people into the climate process, that their concerns weren't really reaching the negotiating table and largely ignored. Some of what they were discussing were things like food security, traditional knowledge about plants, preservation of seeds. They were very concerned about things like food security and nutrition, and healthy lifestyle, the impact of climate change on health. But I didn't find that those concerns about food, about agriculture, the preservation of agricultural knowledge and traditions, I didn't find that this received much airplay where it matters, right? And there were no central agreements about that. No countries coming together to agree to action in those areas. So that's something I noticed. Of course, indigenous people got some airplay. They had very set demands, and there were young people amongst them. The young people amongst the indigenous people are very enthusiastic and eager to carve out a future in which they are working with the government, and they're working with other organizations to retain territories and to govern those territories with, traditional knowledge and so forth, because they feel that they have the knowledge and the practices and the attitude towards the environment that would enable them to be stewards, right, of the forest. Yeah. And the young people I found were very active in that sphere, and really glad to see a lot of young women too, not just male chiefs, but also women were there as well, quite active in those events. I don't know am I answering the question?
Absolutely answering the question, because what I'm hearing too is that we talked about some of the barriers, right? Starting with just the financial barriers. And I was interested too, when you're talking about the barriers, even for you coming from a tertiary level institution, you have a certain amount of privilege. Could you imagine what that means, what that looks like for people in grassroots organizations who don't have have they the privileges. I'm hearing that those barriers existed. I'm hearing the eagerness of young people, the eagerness of the Indigenous communities that showed up. When they got there, were they seen as resource, or was it rhetoric when it comes to COPs welcoming of them? Did it feel as though the young people would be resources? Or was it just as research and adult talk? Like, did you get it?
Like you said, it's a little messy. And in some areas, there is incorporation, and other areas, it's not happening. And one thing is language. So these youth forums, Indigenous youth forums, took place in Portuguese. I suppose, like, right up to that point, maybe there were people mobilizing in Indigenous languages. But at COP30, the official language for them was Portuguese.
So that's a second
barrier. Yes, it is a barrier, but there was language translation equipment. So if you spoke another language, but I don't believe that Indigenous languages were translated. So it was just Portuguese, English, Spanish, French, the typical UN languages. But language issues are a barrier. Portuguese is actually widely spoken in Brazil, but were young people who were asking for climate information to be translated into their languages. That was one of the demands that they were making. Indigenous people were making demands for territories to be named, because while people know they might live in certain areas, they don't necessarily have title for the land or are recognized as the owners of the land, communal owners of the land. And that is an issue, because it means that the government can sell land to farmers, or farmers can buy land and move into their area. And they're facing that. They're facing deforestation from large-scale farming, from mining, from logging, and they're not able to establish their rights in some places. So they were making demands for land, and they in some cases, co-governance of land, which is a very decolonial concept, governing along with other bodies and with the state, a piece of land. And so the Brazilian government at the end of COP 30 made a very symbolic gesture, and real gesture too, by saying that he was giving some territories over to the Indigenous people. So he actually named what territories he was giving to the Indigenous people in the Amazon. And yet at the same time, we know that the Brazilian government has just signed agreements for oil exploration in the Amazon. It's like those contradictions. So on the one end, you give them a little thing, and then in the other end, you take it back because it's causing pollution in their area. It's going back to exploitation of the natural resources in the area, which impacts their quality of life, their health.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the tension too of living on a land that your ancestors have lived on for centuries, and then having the government give it to you. That tension is very real.
Mm-hmm.
I think about how policy language and the language of lived experience differs in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Did that come up in the negotiations?
Yes, the language is very bureaucratic, that the negotiators, when they're putting their agreements together, really there's a lot of debate and tension about the wording of the documents. I think it's because they don't want the political implications, so they want to make the word seem as neutral as possible. But there's quite a bit of tension and debate about how the documents should be worded so that it doesn't imply anything, that some countries are not held responsible, that, for example, they fought over fossil fuels being in the final agreement. When they were working on the Belém political package, there was tension and disagreement about putting the word fossil fuel in the document. Yet, we know this is part of climate change, and that countries are supposed to be working to reduce their carbon imprint and this kind of thing. So I think there's quite a bit in the diplomatic language of the documents that does not resonate with grassroots organizations and their demands.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm very fascinated with, and what I work on in this podcast series as well, I'm interested in refusal and different ways in which we can refuse as scholars, as activists. I want to ask, were there forms of solidarity? Was there pushback or naming of the tensions? Like, how was that visible among the Global South actors at COP?
Well, I would say it was very visible from the first day. You heard conversations that the Global South should not expect that there will be any new deals at COP30, that they should not expect that there was going to be any more radical action apart from what was the agreement from the Paris Agreement from 2015. There was a sense in which the powerful countries are not going to move on certain issues from the start. And I was made aware by other people that there are secret, private conversations, deals going on at the same time during the COP30. Russia, the US wasn't at COP30, but they would have been on the side of countries like Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, who did not want to mention the word fossil fuels. India as well was very fuzzy about being held accountable for lowering their carbon footprint. There was a strong feeling amongst the emerging economies like China and India that the Western countries, Europe, the US, so on, are the ones that bear the real responsibility. Historically, they have been the ones that were to extract and exploit resources from other countries that have been long in this business, and that they should take responsibility. But China and India are big emitters too, but neither were taking leadership roles at COP30. So those countries were kind of on the side of, we don't want fossil fuels mentioned in the final agreement. We don't want to discuss fossil fuels. We're not changing our position. And then you had countries like the small island developing states. There were solidarities between Caribbean islands and Pacific islands. I remember when I was there, we attended other small island pavilions, they call them. Inside of the blue venue, you have pavilions set up by each country, and they hold talks, they have workshops, they have discussion, reasoning sessions, panels that you can attend. And the CARICOM pavilion attended other small island discussions and forums. We would attend the ones put on by Papua New Guinea, by Fiji, by the Pacific Islands. We were very supportive of other small islands, and we had a lot of things in common. We were pressing for loss and damage, climate finance, and these are some of the issues that came up for us and brought unity to us. Except there was a lot of discussion about Guyana, which is now a major oil producer in the region and not really about to slow down their oil production. And they feel that they are a new kid on the block, and really they aren't responsible for what is happening right now. And it's the richer countries, the more powerful countries that need to pay up, right? There were those kinds of tensions and solidarities going on at COP30, for sure. The negotiations were extended, and they were at times tense, with countries calling out each other and insulting each other sometimes. And there was a stalemate at one point, and people thought we were not going to come up with a final agreement. But then Saudi Arabia decided that they would go with a particular wording of the document, and then the document was able to be agreed on by the majority of countries. So it's really a process. Well, I mean, I'm amazed that an agreement came out, given the geopolitical situation in the world right now, with nationalism, war, distrust, all kinds of things going on now in the world. I am amazed that they did come up with an agreement, but a lot of people are still disappointed that it wasn't radical change. Nothing new was being done to halt the climate crisis.
It's bittersweet. So definitely camaraderie, connection, learning, but still countries who have the power being able to exit it is really complex. And I think about, when we think about Caribbean climate futures in terms of heritage and accountability. It's easy to listen to all of this and think, oh my gosh, this is bigger than me. How do we make a stand? So I'm curious about your thoughts around how my Caribbean climate leadership actually do the work of centering Indigenous people, young people. How can we do that in our part of the world?
First of all, Indigenous people and Maroons are increasingly mobilizing in the region. We have the Charlestown Maroons, which have held a conference. In recent years, they have tried to put it on as often as possible. And it includes Maroon and Indigenous people in the region, as well as Latin America, other areas of the world. And certainly they have been networking and making their concerns and demands known, although they're not necessarily represented on international stage. In some cases, for example, there is a Taino chief in Jamaica who is recognized by the Maroons, and they recognized him in a ceremony, but is not recognized by the government of Jamaica yet, that they are people here in Jamaica who consider themselves Taino descended, and that they are eager to revive their traditions and their language and so on. And they have been holding events across the island, particularly in places where they are archaeological sites, Indigenous archaeological sites, and so on. But I think we're yet to see more mobilization coming from them. But they were brought front and center stage during Hurricane Melissa, particularly the effect of Hurricane Melissa on Accompong, what happened to the Maroons there, the devastation that they have endured, but also that they are now, focused on renewal and regeneration and so on. So I think we have to find a way to get to those grassroots voices and have them heard and have them be in the center stage, because often they are the people that are at the front line of climate change. Maroons, Indigenous people, as well as just ordinary people who survive on fishing or farming or live in the poorest areas, in rural areas, and so on. We have to find a way for their voices to be incorporated in national discussions and regional discussions. Although I felt that CARICOM really tried COP30 to bring in case studies from Belize, Guyana, Dominica, of Indigenous people living there and what were some of their experiences and how they were confronting climate change. I felt like CARICOM was making an effort there to highlight the situation of Indigenous people in the Caribbean. UE has just established the Indigenous Research Cluster, which is an effort to bring the issues of Maroons and Indigenous people to national discussion, and to give their voices, their perspectives, their experiences more center stage in our debates and so forth. So I know that University of the West Indies is making that effort. The Center for Reparations at UE as well, that is also promoting Maroon heritage and looking into Maroon culture and how we can prioritize their views and so get them included in national conversations. Their efforts coming from academia, their efforts coming from more national efforts, their efforts coming from the communities themselves. But it's to enable the communities to participate. And I think listen to what they're saying. They would like the indigenous people in Brazil would like more co-governance. They would also like to manage climate finance. The indigenous organizations want their finance to come directly to them because they talk about wastage. And when policymakers are handling the finance, that they don't necessarily know the situation on the ground, they don't understand their communities. It's a very top-down approach, and financing gets lost and somehow it doesn't reach the areas of need in their community. They are now demanding that climate finance be done in a different way, and that there must be a way of incorporating Indigenous people into the actual financing process, to the actual carrying out of projects in their communities. And I think that's something to take on board. It's a very decolonial strategy to kind of include them in different stages of policy making and financing, and where it counts, so it can really make a community impact. I think those are things that we should listen to here in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're delving now into Caribbean realities. And there are many ways in which universities and some of our government organizations actually reproduce some of the very colonial logics that position or attempt to position Indigenous people, Maroon people in a certain way. I'm back to that phrase you started us with, we are the answer. And so the answer doesn't exist within the walls of UWI, but exists within the community. And I was also really intrigued when you spoke about the effort that you perceived that CARICOM was making to talk about what's going on in Belize, in Dominica. These are the experiences here. It's really important for us to be careful about reproducing those colonial extractive dynamics and being careful in our language as well, around enabling. But if we really accept that Indigenous people are the stewards of the land, is really their focus and they are at the helm, what do you think that we need to be careful about at the university level, at the government level? What do we need to be careful about doing and saying that could reproduce these colonial logics? What would a heritage-rooted approach to climate justice and governance look like for the Caribbean region? As a mouthful.
I think more collaboration and cooperation at different levels, different stages of, if it's policy making, if it's project, if it's events, if it's discussions, that they are taken on as partners, research partners. So we even are carrying out research, more radical research now. That certainly the IGDS just completed an Indigenous Peoples project where we were doing kind of a survey across different Caribbean islands of the conditions of Maroon and Indigenous communities. And it was important to bring in community co-researchers and also to give them a stipend for the time that they are spending with us to gather data. It's about respecting people's time and respecting their experience and their knowledge. So you don't go in there assuming that you are bringing knowledge to them or you are extracting data or information from them, but you are including them in the process. And when you do generate your data or your information, that it is shared with the community first to see if they are in agreement with what is being said, and that you include them as authors when you are publishing your reports or book, because they played a part in the research. And sometimes they give you the phrases and the statements to put into your report that you are going to take to a government agency or regionally. This proper acknowledgement of their participation, this opinion that they're uneducated, that they're not enlightened. These are colonial era type of stereotypes. At the same time, you have to be careful not to romanticize, because that is out there too, like this kind of romanticization of Indigenous people as the natives of the land. They know more than anybody about the relationship with nature. They are closer to nature. They are in harmony with the environment. And sometimes there are cases when this is not the case. And you have to be careful. It can get dicey. It can get, particularly if you're working with them on Indigenous people or Maroons on projects and so on. There's a lot of tension about how they are represented and that you don't say something that they don't agree with. And while I agree with that, sometimes there are some politics in the communities and so on. It brings to light that these are communities just like any other.
This notion that Indigenous people can't handle money. That's what I hear when I do the climate financing. We can't handle money. And I am hearing you around not romanticizing it as well, understanding that there are politics in Indigenous communities. You have to be so careful.
Yeah, and to find balance and to respect how they want to be seen, respect opinions, and understand that they are capable. They know their communities the best. They know the situation, whatever it is that they're facing. They have developed ways to adapt to the environment that are important, knowledge. I realized that the Indigenous people were also saying that they were willing to include or to work with people in technology, people in science, to bring the two knowledges together. I saw a lot of open-mindedness, particularly the younger ones, that they wanted a kind of collaboration between their traditional practices and science and technology to see what are the best ways. Maybe there is a traditional practice that could be improved with technology, or maybe there is a way in which technology and agriculture could replace a certain thing that they used to do, and it's done better. And so I found that to be quite insightful, and I was happy to see that there was that kind of openness.
What's really clear is that we can't shy away from the emotional, the ethical, and the political questions that we ask. We just can't. Yeah, that is a way that we can't sit and wait for permission to take space as well. And I think that's particularly from a Caribbean perspective, from small island development states. And that we as universities, policymakers, regional bodies, we have a responsibility to do things. I want to ask you, what do you want Global South listeners to hold close as we imagine our climate futures?
We ought to be thinking about the different ways in which we can collaborate at the different levels and work together at the different levels. I think that we must try to integrate traditional knowledge. I think that we must try to incorporate maybe some of our plant knowledge and heritage of how to manage the environment, how to use its resources. In Jamaica, we have very specific things about how to communicate or deal with nature. But plants at a certain time, we have certain traditional knowledges that we use that could be important, and we must draw on that. Maybe to think about nature-based solutions.
Yes.
As well. We have to be open-minded to change, and that we have to be open-minded to dialogue. I think dialogue is very important, that communities and organizations and state institutions maintain dialogue, and inclusion is important. Listening to the populations that are most affected by climate change. Those tend to be the poorest and the most vulnerable, those living on the coast, those who live off the land, Maroons, Indigenous people, urban city dwellers as well. They sometimes get overlooked, and some of the worst climate impacts are happening in cities. The flooding because there's not enough drainage, and that has to be considered as well. You have to bring different people to the table, different perspectives, different voices, working in a collaborative way. CARICOM, I've seen them express an interest in unity across the Caribbean, coming together to agree on certain points and being quite strategic in how they get their message across, because we are small island developing states, but we can make a loud noise, and I think partnerships will be important with other countries too. Partnerships with other small island countries that are going through similar issues, regional partnerships in Latin America as well. This is important for the future. But that financing and funding issue is always going to be an issue. And it's something that when I saw the Indigenous mobilization for COP30, I was like, yeah, this is what we need to do in the Caribbean. Like, we have got to mobilize. We've got to help each other find some way of raising funds amongst each other, because only together are we going to make a difference. Not as individual islands, but we really do have to come together with other people to face the challenges of the future.
I'm hearing representation matters.
Mm-hmm.
So does cooperation and connection. And so does our individual relationship with the land. You were speaking, I had a memory and flooded.
Yes, yeah.
Remember my mother telling me, like, you can't pick plants in the night. She will always be like, there was a piece of bush that we need to take. My grandmother used to speak about asking permission before you take plants. And a few minutes ago, you were talking and that image came to mind as well. And just the continuum of this work, right? So it's representation at these big events, but they're all the things that we need to do between our individual memory and connection to the land and show up at COP30 and all matter.
Yes, because it's not just, even though the region is pushing climate finance and the region is also pushing loss and damage and the importance of this for the region. And there's no doubt that that's the case. There are also these emotional, psychosocial things that really are important too, but not being discussed. What happens when people lose their land, whether it's covered by the sea or it's, in natural disasters, have your house is damaged. I was watching a news report about, a lot of Jamaicans have family land and they bury their ancestors on their family land. And I didn't think about this when those massive waves came into St. Elizabeth. And those areas. It also destroyed people's grave sites of their family. I remember seeing this newscast of this man saying, this grave of his daughter had moved and been damaged by the winds and the rains. There is really more to this than just the economic damage of it. There's the emotional loss of connection to family and ancestry, and whether people can even go back to the land and rebuild again. Some islands in the Pacific are losing their coastlines. People are losing their connection to the land and their heritage, or had to move from their small islands to New Zealand or Australia. Those are issues that are less discussed, but they're just as important.
Thank you so much of bringing those things to the fore. I feel as though you opened a window for us to look in at COP30, and then you also took us to the places between where we are and that big forum. You brought up the socio-emotional and the cultural and the psychosocial impact, because so often we get stuck on the notion of climate financing and how we're going to pay for this economic thing. The disheartening reality of losing a gravesite, for instance, and what that means in terms of how people sustain. So thanks for bringing that up. I think those are things that really resonated with me in this reasoning. So as we close, I want to invite you to offer a reflection about what you believe is possible when Indigenous knowledge, youth leadership, and women's voices all shape climate change agendas with integrity. What is possible?
Wow, that's a big question. I think what stood out for me was the second biennial Amazonias exhibition that was going on in Belém at the same time as COP30. Participants were encouraged to attend outside of the venue and going downtown to Belém and seeing where the port was, and then looking at the paintings of Amazonian artists, also Afro-Brazilian artists from the region. And they also tried to connect with Caribbean artists, but the majority of artists there were Latin American. I thought that the exhibition, the paintings, the sculptures that were there really resonated with me. I really got the sense of how they see nature, and in some of the paintings, they show themselves as being in relationship with nature. They are not necessarily the king of the jungle. You see them in interrelationship with the trees, with the animals, as well as with mythical creatures, also with their ancestors, as well as those who are to come. And I really got the sense of interconnection, a kind of decentering of human beings from the center of the earth. It really kind of shifted my thinking. Because what would the earth look like if we were more cognizant of the agency of nature, the agency of animals, the agency of the forest, the agency of other beings other than human beings? And maybe that we could learn something from nature, marine animals, and how they have had to adjust to more polluted environments, and how animals have had to adjust to forest fires and mining and all sorts of things. They have been also making adjustments. If you observe their behavior, there might be something you can learn from it. Marine mammals come together in pods to face challenges at sea, whether it's pollution, whether it's warming seas. They do things collaboratively. And is there something that we can learn from that? I just think that shift in thinking was really insightful for me.
That's a beautiful way to end. There's so much that we can learn. Thank you so much, Doreen.
I really enjoyed sharing my experiences. Thank you for the opportunity.
My deepest thanks to Doreen Gordon for opening a window into COP30 and for helping us think beyond the official negotiations to communities, memories, relationships, and the forms of knowledge that must shape our climate futures. This conversation reminds us that representation matters and that presence must be accompanied by decision-making power, resources, respect, and meaningful participation. Climate justice also asks us to recognize losses that exceed economic calculation. When coastlines disappear, homes are destroyed, ancestral graves are displaced, and communities are forced from their land, people lose part of the cultural and emotional worlds through which they understand themselves. As Doreen reminds us, our way forward depends on cooperation. It requires dialogue across communities, disciplines, regions, generations, and forms of knowledge. It also requires the courage to enter global spaces with the understanding that we little but we talawa, and the answer is already among us. You can find more information about Doreen's work and other Saltwater Reasoning episodes at www.tracyrogers.com/saltwater reasonings. Until the next time, take care.